This is Anne. She's a 1954 Series 11 Jawa Perak, and boy is she beautiful.
If you're an enthusiast of motorcycles, you never knew things like this exist unless you have some guy that's on your street that has one that's riding it around actively and letting people see that something this beautiful is a real thing. It's really neat. This bike blows people's minds because there's no other motorcycle that looks like it. And when you're riding down the street, it doesn't even sound like a normal motorcycle. It sounds completely unto its own. It's just a very interesting motorcycle, and people they're blown away by it. They look at it and it's like, what is that? Is it new? No, it's not new. It's really old and it's really beautiful. It was pure Art Deco. Everything about it really reflected kind of the way the Czech Republic was before the war. They were ahead on design ideas and they were the masters of deco. You can see that in this bike.
Every motorcycle restoration has a story, and Anne's story began in an old barn in Luckenbach, Texas. Having gotten a tip from a friend about an old Jawa, Vincenzo Murphy jumped in his truck thinking he was gonna pick up a spare parts bike. You see, he already owned a Jawa 350 Californian, but what he ended up finding in that barn was completely unexpected.
It was freezing cold. Vincenzo gave me a call and said, do you want to come out to the hill country, pick up a bike? And I'm thinking, sure. I love bikes. Sure. And jump in his truck and away we go, and he's telling me he's picking up this Jawa Perak.
We followed this labyrinth through all this stuff to get to a school bus. And when we got to the school bus, it had not one, but two Peraks in it. And I said, that's a Jawa Perak? He goes, I know what it is. I said, well, I just assumed it was a 350 California. He goes, well, you're wrong. I said, now I'm even more excited. I said, because I've never seen a Perak in real life.
When you first saw Anne, what was your first impression of it?
Wow, this poor baby needs a lot of love. Yeah, like any bike, a barn find or whatever you call them, you know, she was in a pretty sad way. But as you know, Vincenzo, we're talking about Vincenzo, and he's a very passionate cat. He can bring bikes back to life. He's got that thing, that touch. And he was excited, you know. He was going to bring her back to life, you know.
Anne had seen better days. She wasn't in the best shape, but after quick inspection, Vincenzo noticed one redeeming feature.
When I walked around Anne, the thing that stuck to me was that the tank was nearly perfect. And when you're deciding which way you're going to go, whether restore it or just sympathetically bring it back to life, there are some key parts of the bike that you have to consider. And with the Perak specifically is chroming. They can't chrome over filled dents. And so this tank was nearly perfect. There's a couple of small, little tiny blemishes that are almost, you can't even tell for the most part. But when I send the tank out to Brown's Plating, they did a great job and brought it back, you know. And so that was the center of this whole thing, was the tank. The tank was perfect, or as close to perfect as you could ever hope for. And that made me want to go nuts and do it correctly.
And being the motorcycle whisperer that he is, it didn't take long to get her running again.
Then he gave us a call and said, come over, man, and because he's only down the street from me, and roll up. And he'd taken the tank off. He had, you know, temporary plastic tank, done the mix, put it in there, couple of kicks, and she fired up. I was blown away, man. It's like, yeah, 2 days or something since he had it, and he had her running. Pretty cool.
Oh, mate, you're a bloody legend.
This bike wanted to live. It was really easy. And the day I got the bike, I took off the gas tank. I have a little tank that I use for when I'm working on bikes. And I went through and I cleaned the carburetor. The had a weird ignition system on it, so I just got what I needed to make it spark. And then I started it up and I rode it around the block. I rode it to Wig's house to show him that the thing lives. That was like the day after we got it.
I was amazed, man. To be honest, no surprises, but I remember it was wild. He said to me that he took her for a bit of a quick little spin and she went through all the gears, which is amazing, you know, and he got her to run. And then the journey started after that, where he brought her back, you know.
When you look at the carb cover, they didn't have to do this. They could have just had the carb hanging out like every other bike has, but they took the cylinder, they casted it so it continues on to this line. And the cover is just a continuation of everything, so it all looks like one piece. I just started getting into it, and the hardest part was the paint, which I didn't even do the work on, but you know, I went through the motor, replaced the clutch, replaced the primary chain, because the clutch had like a ad hoc collection of bits to make it clamp down, because I guess they didn't have the parts. So there's like pieces of wood in there and just weird things. It's like, what is all this about? So I had to source a lot of those bits. And then the other part was I had to replace the shift shaft, because the shift shaft spline was stripped. The splines were all stripped off of it. It's neat how they used one shaft to actuate the Kickstarter and the shifter. Well, it's actually two shafts that one goes inside another. So the Kickstarter is the outer big shaft, the shifter is the inner shaft. The cool thing about the Jawa is you don't have to split the cases to replace the shift shaft. They engineered it to where you could pull it out from the other side. There's clips, you undo the clips and you slide it out, and then all the dog ears that hook into it, you access those from the primary side. And it's just amazing how brilliant and simple it is. So I was able to just do it without splitting the cases or taking the motor out, and it just further emphasized how much of a reliable, easy to fix motorcycle that this is, and why people love it, because it is easy to live with and it just wants to keep performing and working for you. It's a really good bike.
I can remember, you know, going over to hang out with him and chat, and he'd have the motor pull down and stuff, you know, and then he'd be everything from, you know, respoking the rims, doing the whole thing, then getting the paint work done. You know, it was quite a journey, you know, but real credit to him, man. It's beautiful.
Ann's life began in tumultuous times. World War II was raging, and the Czech Republic was occupied by Nazi Germany.
During the war, the Germans commandeered factories in the Czech Republic and used them as they needed the factories to be used, meaning that if you made something before the war, that didn't necessarily mean you were going to make that same thing. The Germans dictated what you were going to produce, because the Germans needed manufacturing capability and the Czechs were excellent at manufacturing. But Jawa had a clandestine factory because they knew that this war wasn't going to last forever. And by knowing that, they said, we got to develop a model that's going to be brand new out of the box, not a rehash of before the war, but something brand new if we want to get good footing after the war. And so they came up with a Perak, and Perak means spring. So they added a rear suspension to this thing, a springing suspension. So Perak is spring. And they named it exactly what the innovative feature was. Rear suspension was not common before the war. So it was one of their things. It's like, we're going to give people rear suspension. That's trick shit, you know? And so that's what they did, which is trick shit. They disguised the bikes as military bikes that were just from before the war, and they were riding the bikes up and down, testing them right in front of the Germans. And the Germans didn't even realize that these were new motorcycles. This was a creation that was soup to nuts, completely different than any Jawa done before the war, and it was completely modern, relatively speaking, to other bikes after the war.
I didn't know, was he just going to get it happening again, leave patina on it, you know what I mean? But he decided to go balls out, and bring her back to this beautiful, like, pristine, how she would have looked back in the day off the showroom floor.
The Perak was designed for the common everyday man, the guy that was the worker, but they wanted to give the worker something that it could be proud of.
When he brought it back to the standard color, as you know, when he found it, it wasn't the standard color, and he brought it back to that gorgeous kind of, maroon vibe, which was the stock color. And yeah, it just like, wow, man, this thing's beautiful, Definitely when he had all the paintwork done and she was all put together like that, and wow, it's gorgeous,
The headlight kind of it's just part of the bike. It's not bolted on, it's part of the bike. It's just beautiful the way they did that. It's like, who does this? This is amazing. I've never seen another bike like it. When you look at how the Perak is made, there wasn't a lot of equals in the 250 two-stroke range that are made as nice and just as beautiful as the Perak. That's what draws me to it. It's just really a beautiful motorcycle. I love her. I'm proud of it. The restoration in this bike turned out really beyond my expectation, because if you would have seen it before and what it turned into, they're two different animals. And then you got to realize, I'm a Cro-Magnon. My shop is really cluttered, and there's just not a lot of space and all that stuff. And to turn something like this out is pretty neat, and it was fun. I'm totally happy with how it turned out.